Hey guys, hope you're doing well. I got 5 tips for you today. I think they're really going to help you improve your mixes. If you enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you're into producing, mixing, mastering orchestral music, go check out my Patreon page. I'll put that link in the description below. All right, number 1, tame the beast that is your lower mid-range in your mixes. I think this is probably the most important step towards achieving clarity and definition in your mixing. The problem is that a lot of these amazing sample libraries that we use to get our big orchestral sound, like brass and string and percussion libraries, they sound great right out of the box, but when you combine them all together in your track, you get this mid-range, low mid-range buildup around 200 to 500 hertz. So pretty much by default, I have an EQ on every single channel in my mix. And oftentimes I will be dipping out, in that range around 200 to 500, depending on the instrument. And not a lot, but those little dips, those little cuts, they really add up in the end. And then when I'm finished writing my track, I'm not left with this accumulation of lower mid-range mud that just completely dominates the mix. A lot of people reached out to me in the last year, sending me their mixes that got rejected by music libraries for one reason or another. And I have to say that this is probably the most common problem I hear in a lot of these mixes, is that there's just so much muddiness. So I'd highly recommend embracing this idea. And I think that it's probably the most important thing that I could suggest in terms of achieving that clarity and that definition that you want in your mixes. Number 2, be mindful of how you're applying your reverb. Now, most of us already know that once we get too generous with our reverb, we start to drown out the definition of our track. So the thing is, a lot of these sample libraries that we're using, they have different mic positions built into the library. Now, consider that it might make more sense sometimes to use a roomier mic mix in your sample library rather than use a closed mic mix and adding reverb to it. Now, with regards to bussing multiple different instruments into a reverb auxiliary track, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that we should get experimental with our reverb. It's not all instruments are necessarily going to sound great going through the same reverb send. I think it's important to experiment with different decays and different depths and different types of reverb for different instruments. And lastly, make sure that you're not adding too much muddiness into your mix by adding reverb to instruments with a lot of low-end information. Often in the reverb, I'll just roll off the low end a little bit for instruments that are kind of bass heavy, so that I'm not adding tons of mud and I'm just getting a nice kind of tail on the top end. Number 3, listen to your mixes on multiple sets of speakers and give it a day before you print your final mix. So you've probably already heard this advice about the different speakers, but I can't stress it enough. I never put any music out there until I listen to it, until I listen to the mix on my MacBook speakers. And why? Because I just know those speakers really intimately. I know how they sound, and I listen to a lot of music on my laptop. And I know that if the mix sounds decent there, it's probably going to translate well. I do a lot of my writing and my producing on my headphones, and my headphones are good quality. They have a pretty flat EQ curve, but as soon as I turn those speakers on, my Yamaha speakers, I always hear something that I didn't with the headphones on, and then furthermore, I always catch something extra with my laptop speakers. So I usually do my mixes on at least 3 different types of speakers. And then for me personally, I never commit to a final mix until I've slept on it. I do the best I can, and then I put it away, go to bed, wake up with fresh ears the next morning, grab a cup of coffee, and then I listen to the mix, and I always hear something that I missed. That's just me personally. Everyone has a different style of how they approach their mixing, but that works for me. Number 4, decide which instrument or element in your mix is playing the starring role at any given moment in your song. Another really common problem I hear in people's mixes is that everything is happening all at once. Everything is as loud as everything else. And this is not good. I think it's really important to make a decision about which element of your mix is going to be front and center. And then once you make that decision, you got to ask yourself, how does the rest of the instrumentation in the song play a supportive role? So let's say we have this beautiful melody happening in the most intense section of your song, and we also have this epic percussion happening at the same time. Well, I'm going to make a decision that I want that melody to be at the front and the center of the mix, and that epic percussion is, it's going to be loud. You're going to be able to feel it, but it's going to be sitting just behind the melody, and it's going to be propping the melody up rather than fighting with it. So maybe that melody goes away and then the percussion becomes, the front and center element of your track. We can play with those, those different elements in the track, throughout the song. But at any given moment, I'm pretty much making a decision about who is, the star of the show. And I'm asking myself, how do I use the mix to tell the listener what I want them to hear? Lastly, number 5, think of your mix as having 3 dimensions and create movement in your transitions. So what do I mean by 3 dimensions? Well, you could think of bass and treble as being your height, and you could think of the stereo field as like panning left to right as being width, and you could think of volume balance and reverb and effects as being depth. So all of you think about these concepts intuitively when you're mixing, but it's really important to think about how we can create dynamic and interesting mixes by using movement between the dimensions. So for example, say we want to create some interesting contrast between our intro and our back end, or between the verse and the chorus, whatever you want to call it. So let's say I have this like really tight staccato string pattern happening in my intro, and I've got it kind of like, it's not panned, it's just kind of centered, and it's up close. And it's tight. And when we get to our chorus or our back end, I want to open it up. So I'm not going to just use volume dynamics to make that contrast. I'm going to use the stereo field as well. So maybe I'll add a layer of like synth, and I'll hard pan it to the right, and then I'll add a solo violin, and I'll hard pan it to the left, and I'll add some reverb to those, so that when we get to our chorus, we're not just like getting louder, we're just opening up the stereo field. So that's just like kind of like, and then once we get to back to our second verse, I'll close it back in again. So that's just one way to kind of like create more interest rather than just like it being louder. You're creating more movement in the field. Oftentimes I'll just add like texture elements or like a synth to the mix, and I'll just pan it slowly. I'll auto pan it slowly from like left to right, so it's just dancing across the stereo field, and it won't be totally obvious when you hear it, but it's there, and it's just creating some subtle movement in the mix, and it's just kind of like ear candy. Transitions are a great place to start thinking about this kind of stuff. Like you could do so many things and get creative with it. Like you could take a riser, for example, and you could automate the pan so that it's like moving from like the left to the right as it gets louder. Or you can like automate a filter sweep, so you can you can move between like the bass and the treble of that riser. Sometimes I'll even automate the reverb so that an element of the track that's starting like right up front and center is being pushed further away, and maybe I'll replace it with another element of the track that's moving closer and closer. So all I'm really suggesting is just get creative with movement. This is something that often gets overlooked, and I really think it could turn an otherwise interesting mix into like a totally mind-blowing mix. Okay, that's it for today, guys. Thanks so much for listening. I hope I got you inspired, and I hope I got you thinking about some ways that you can explore your mixes and make them more interesting. If you have any questions at all, hit me up in the comments, reach out to me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, peace.